I think if Tebbit and Thatcher were still in charge, we wouldn't be having the OBR issuing the Britain's death warrant as they did this week.
4.
I firmly believe Reform are on track to emerge as the largest political party at the next general election.
3.
Labour's sort of favoured multiculturalism project was certainly in jeopardy, and Blair openly called on Muslims to integrate.
2.
Tax rises in the forthcoming autumn budget, which we all, of course, look forward to with great glee.
1. We have liftoff.
Welcome once again to Planet Normal, the Telegraph podcast with Alison Pearson.
Hello.
And me, Liam Halligan. This week marked the 20th anniversary of 7/7. That's the 7th of July 2005, which saw 4 coordinated suicide attacks on London by 4 Islamist terrorists, 3 of them second-generation Pakistani immigrants from Leeds. 3 of the homemade bombs carried in backpacks were detonated in quick succession aboard London Underground tube trains. The 4th was deployed aboard a double-decker bus in central London's Tavistock Square. 52 people were killed in total, aside from the bombers themselves, and nearly 800 injured. It was the UK's deadliest terrorist incident since the 1988 Lockerbie bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 and our first Islamist suicide attack. Since then, of course, we've seen many, many more fatal terror attacks, including the murder of British soldier Lee Rigby in 2013, the 2017 Westminster Bridge attacks, which killed 4, including PC Keith Palmer, of course, and then the Manchester Arena bombing of 2017, which killed 22 and injured in excess of 1,000, including many young girls, given that the target was an Ariana Grande concert. 2017 also saw the London Bridge Borough Market attacks, which killed 8 and wounded almost 50, the Parsons Green tube attacks, which injured 30, fatal stabbings in Reading, Hartlepool, and the murder of Sir David Amess MP in his Southend constituency office in 2021. These are just some of the attacks where the Islamist motivation and involvement have been acknowledged and confirmed by the authorities. And yet on Monday, the 20th anniversary of 7/7, Alison, you and many others felt we're still failing to fully recognise the dangers facing this country, a subject you addressed head-on in your latest Telegraph column, link in the show notes to this episode. I wrote about rather more mundane issues, my suspicions of an incoming Labour wealth tax in my Sunday Telegraph column, again link in the show notes, and as if by magic, on Monday and Tuesday, we had various Labour grandees, including former leader Neil Kinnock and Chancellor Rachel Reeves herself, doing much to confirm my predictions. And that, just as the Office for Budget Responsibility issued its own broadside against the government, the official fiscal watchdog, talking of now, quotes, daunting budgetary issues facing the UK. It's as if those OBR boffins, Alison, have been listening to you on Planet Normal, economist extraordinaire that you are, for the last 24 months. Your old boyfriend, Emmanuel Macron's in London, Alison. Yes, you did used to fancy him, and you've interviewed a fabulous Planet Normal guest. But before we talk about 7/7, let's just have a few words about the man they called the Chingford skinhead, the semi-house-trained polecat, sobriquets, which I know he rather enjoyed.
R.I.P. Norman. He's a great loss, isn't he, Liam? I went to interview him at his home in Bury St Edmunds 10 years ago. Still absolutely redoubtable, aged 82, razor sharp, also impeccably courteous and extremely witty. We were talking about the Thatcher era and he said, Margaret and I made the same mistake years ago. He says, we failed to have ourselves cloned. Absolutely. Too true. I think if Tebbit and Thatcher were still in charge, we wouldn't be having the OBR issuing the Britain's death warrant as they did this week. But yeah, you met him, didn't you, Liam?
I did. The man with 2 bosses called Margaret, of course, because his beloved wife was also called Margaret. His wife, of course, who was crippled tragically in that IRA Brighton bomb in the mid-1980s, and Lord Tebbit spent much of the later part of his adult life caring for his wife Margaret, of course, and really truncating his political career for that reason. I didn't know him as well as I knew a lot of the other big political beasts of that era, like Norman Lamont, Nigel Lawson, Ken Clarke, and so on. But I did meet him once or twice, and the first time I met him, and I think this is worth reflecting on, the first time I met him was in the early 1990s. It was a very small Westminster dinner. I was working for a think tank. There were several Conservative cabinet ministers round the table. And you've got to remember, we're going to talk about terrorist attacks on this podcast, of course, but this was the early 90s. We'd seen all kinds of IRA terrorism. This is way before the Good Friday Agreement. We'd seen mortar bombs in Downing Street. We still had the Canary Wharf attack to come. We still had the Manchester Arndale Centre attack to come. It was a time of real paranoia in Westminster. The IRA had just attacked the Colton Club, crikey, the sort of Tory grand watering hole in posh central London. And as so often happens at these sort of semi-work dinner parties, you go around the table and say who you are. And I was just a young graduate student, and I said my sort of Irish name in my broad proletariat accent. And there was a sort of bit of a collective intake of breath around the table because, of course, Norman Tebbit's life had been utterly, utterly transformed by the IRA. They tried to murder him. He was famously rescued by fire services from that Brighton bomb, one of the iconic political images of our time, when he was pulled out of that wreckage live on breakfast television.
Yes.
And then, of course, after that dinner, he was going home to care for his then crippled wife. And yet he started the dinner by spending several minutes in front of everybody around the table, talking to me, asking me about my education, asking me about my ambitions, saying how pleased he was to meet me, saying, I'm sure your parents are very proud of you. You're doing very well at university, in your graduate work. I've heard things about your work. Just putting me at ease and putting the whole table at ease, despite how it must have been very, very difficult for him. He was always personally extremely nice to me. That sounds ridiculous today. Yes, of course he was. Why wouldn't he be? I'm a Telegraph columnist. But this was the early 1990s. There was an awful lot of, Irish-based terrorism. The Tory party itself under attack, and him particularly, very personally, negatively affected. And yet he went out of his way to put a very young, nervous graduate student, wide-eyed, all these big political beasts in front of him, completely at his ease. It was a classy move.
I think a lot of people have said, as you just said, Liam, that he was always nicest to the least important person in any room, which I think is the mark of his character. What I hadn't realised when I went to interview him was obviously I knew that he and Margaret had been buried in the wreckage of the Grand Hotel in Brighton during that party conference in 1984, buried alive for several hours. But Norman said that he had been a young airman doing national service, and his Meteor 8 came down in a field and his oxygen mask filled with blood. And he remembers seeing the flames licking at the fuel tank. And he said to me, he thought that first catastrophe had given him great strength and enough to survive that monstrous second tragedy and to bear the cross of a paralysed wife, and who did ask him to give up front bench politics so she wouldn't be lonely, which he did, which I think was a noble sacrifice. But also I think the history of the Conservative Party would have been different had Tebbit stayed on in front bench politics, because he was the key member, wasn't he, of Margaret Thatcher's Praetorian Guard. And I'm not sure they would have done her in so unceremoniously if Norman had been there, because he was a formidable opponent, wasn't he?
I think Keith Joseph was her intellectual crumpet and kind of ideas man, and Norman Tebbit was her enforcer. They were the ultimate dries in the kind of wet versus dry debate of that era. And we mustn't get completely sidetracked, but just talking about this with you now, Alison, so many echoes from history with the current situation on the right and centre-right of British politics today.
Indeed so. And in fact, that government, the Thatcher government, which had to come in and pull us out of the morass of the 70s, and you've often said it feels like in terms of the economy, we seem to be back in that dreadful doom loop of the 70s. And something else that connects Tebbit to this week, I think, is Norman took a very hard line on immigration, which was unfashionable for some time, but is now very much back at the heart of the debate, isn't it?
It is. So tell me how you felt on Monday, on the day of the St. Paul's ceremony. We're very good at all the pomp and circumstance and at marking these occasions, aren't we? But you felt, and this really came through in your writing this week. You felt that some of our political leaders were ever so slightly mincing their words.
Yeah, I mean, there was only one political leader who even said the word Islamist, and that, to her credit, was Kemi Badenoch, who talked about the great suffering unleashed on them. Everyone who was alive then, of course, will have memories of that terrible day. As a family, we had an intimate connection to the tragedy because my children's young babysitter, Laura, who was a beloved family friend as well as the babysitter and still is all these years later. Laura was on the Circle Line travelling east that day. She was travelling with her mum to her office. Laura was just 22 years old, and I got a call, a very baffling call, sort of mid-morning, and it was Laura, who was and is, Liam, the most capable sort of girl guide type of girl, brilliant in a crisis.
Well, she'd have to be to keep your lot in line.
She was, yeah, she was.
Including you.
She was formidable, and she sounded completely unlike herself, and I was just distracted. I thought, what's she going on about? She kept saying, we were on the train, but not in that carriage. And I kept saying, what do you mean, train? What do you mean?
Yeah.
And then it took me an hour or so to hear on the news. In fact, a detail I could never quite get over, Laura and her mum and many others, of course, who were not killed or savagely injured, they were trapped below ground in the Aldgate tunnel for a long time. And Laura said when they got to the surface and she shouted at the police, who had, along with other emergency services, had decided not to go down and save the people because safety protocols appeared to prevent them doing that. And that's another dreadful story. But she said she and her mum, Katie, got to the office, and obviously they were totally in shock, but they didn't really realise what had happened. And they got into the lift in Katie's offices and they saw themselves in the mirror and they were just completely black. What Laura had witnessed, and found a poor chap kneeling by the side of the tracks who was almost entirely charred. And he had been in the bomb carriage where this guy, Shehzad Tanweer, detonated the bomb. And this chap, in fact, who turned out to be called Philip, had all his clothes blown off and various other things. And he was blinded in one eye because by a bit of the bomber's shin bone, if you can believe that, Liam. So I suppose what I'm trying to say is that it was absolutely horrific. And I feel that there is a tendency with these Islamist terrorist attacks to almost immediately try to play them down and to yoke in the far right as a sort of equivalent threat, which is complete nonsense. And then people will say, we did everything we possibly could. Communities are pulling together, isn't it marvellous? And British people who get angry that these barbaric fanatics are allowed into our country in huge numbers. We also see people coming across the channel now, don't we? 21,000 this year alone, young men from backward misogynistic cultures coming into our country. And then the people who get upset about these horrific incidents are accused by Mayor Sadiq Khan of sowing division and hate. Well, I think we know who the haters were on that day in July 2005. They were the ones with the bombs in their backpacks. And even the King, Liam, spoke euphemistically of tragic events. The Prime Minister said lives were lost. They weren't lost. Men and women were savagely wrenched from this life by mass murderers. So I think for me, it's sort of the whole 20th anniversary look back, slightly soft focus, not really wanting to confront the fact that the situation in this country with Islamists and the problems with immigration, I think, are considerably worse. And the political class has never truly wrestled with what the meaning of the 7-7 was.
There's a huge amount of detail in your column. You talk about subsequent accounts of the performance of the emergency services on that day. You refer to a very interesting lecture, which I must admit I'd forgotten about, which Tony Blair gave soon after.
Very powerful lecture.
Yeah, when, of course, he was still the Prime Minister.
Yes.
We should remember. And he gave a very, very important speech, which I think now you've kind of unearthed it and written about it in such a prominent place, we're going to get other people poring over that speech as well, because it was a bit of an admission that Labour's sort of favoured multiculturalism project was certainly in jeopardy, and Blair openly called on Muslims to integrate and so on. A lot less pussyfooting around, if you like. And a long time ago, which is very much to Blair's credit, whatever other criticisms we can throw at him. I'll always remember 7/7, of course, because I was working at Channel 4 News, and I was scootering my way to the ITM building in Gray's Inn Road, which is sort of near the city. I was coming from East London, where I lived then. And the epicenter of the terrorist attack, the first one was Edgware Road, which is over in West London, as people who know the capital well will instantly recognise. And it was pre-social media. We had brick phones, and I pulled up at ITN, and people were outside. And I saw one of my ITN editors, and he just screamed, "Go, go, go, Edgware Road." I didn't even get off my bike. And someone just chucked a camera under my arm, one of those big old, huge TV cameras of that era.
Yeah.
And I went on my scooter to Edgware Road, and I barely knew how to use the camera. Idiot economics correspondent. I managed to flick the thing on, and I caught some pictures, including some of the pictures. There were other cameras there by then, maybe even other ITN cameras, I'm not sure, but I did record some pictures of people coming out of Edgware Road Station, famously with the sort of paper masks over their face, full of sort of surgical liniment, ointment, completely disproportionate to the scale of their injuries. And I spent the whole of that day outside Edgware Tube Station, a lot of the time talking to eyewitnesses, talking to people coming out, talking to emergency services, or staring down a camera, talking to audiences, not just in the UK, but across the world with ITN's affiliates. It was an astonishing day. And one of the most profound journalistic experiences of my life was that day, not just, looking at the turmoil and trying to get my head around the enormity of the politics of this and the sort of security implications of this. I'd also been very heavily involved in ITN's coverage of 9/11, of course, just 4 years before the 11th of September attacks. But what I always take from that day is somebody sidled up to me, and it was a very, very gently spoken Iraqi man, and he was extremely well educated, and he was a dentist, and he said he had his dental surgery around that area in Paddington. There's lots of sort of medical, and there are hospitals around there, St Mary's. There's lots of sort of medical people around there. And I had half a dozen conversations with him throughout the day. He kind of slightly shadowed me, and I've got his card somewhere, and we never got together afterwards, but we just had such a, for me, profound and moving conversation about what was actually going on here in human terms. And this was an extremely moderate Muslim man who'd come to the UK as a young person, been trained in the UK, made his life in the UK. And of course, there are, many thousands, hundreds of thousands, now millions of good, decent Muslim people in this country, following the British dream and doing well and doing their best for themselves and their families at all strata of society. But it does strike me that we have a problem. And the problem is obviously a lot worse than it was in 2005. And I totally agree with you. The response from our political leaders was lily-livered. The first thing you can do to solve and address a problem, it's like alcoholism, is admit that there is a problem. And we're trying to pretend there isn't a problem. And we're trying to pretend that, the real problem of terrorism in this country is, far-right thugs. Of course, there are far-right thugs, and of course they are a problem. But it's a minuscule problem compared to the much, much, much bigger problem. And this problem is accelerating. It's getting a lot worse.
I was reminded of the sort of situation which was brilliantly satirised by this American comedian, Norm Macdonald, sadly no longer with us. And he tweeted, "What terrifies me is if ISIS was to detonate a nuclear device and kill 50 million Americans. Imagine the backlash against peaceful Muslims." And that, that's very strong, tart satire. Yeah. But he was certainly onto something there because, as you say, there's an extreme reluctance among the authorities and the institutions to tackle that. And I think Blair's was the most forthright. I still think he is still our shrewdest analyst of the thing. And I was in touch actually on the anniversary, can't mention who this is, extremely senior
You're such a tease.
in counter-terrorism. I called him Jake.
Okay.
And I asked Jake how the Islamist threat was today, in his view, compared to July 2005. And what he said really shocked me. In fact, I didn't print some of it because it was too shocking. But the gist was, the truth is the threat has grown inexorably. Perversely, the reason why there are no real terror attacks now is because they are getting what they want. We are where they want us to be. We have their religion enshrined outside of UK law, and their community leaders have got the police under control. They are wily, and when they see do-gooders and appeasers, they walk all over them like the scorpion and the frog. It's what they do. And Jake continued, the numbers are now so huge that our own government has sleepwalked into a nightmare of extraordinary proportions. They are building while we are continually lying to ourselves. And can I just say, Liam, I agree with you. And I have some Muslim friends,
Me
and
too.
I know there are many Muslims who have successfully integrated. But unfortunately, the fact is that there are now ghettos in many places across the country where the alienation from mainstream society is so great that if you were a Muslim boy or girl in Luton, where 79% of babies now have at least one foreign-born parent, and almost all of those children in Luton will now be Muslims, you wouldn't come across anybody who wasn't like yourself, right? You wouldn't. This idea Blair had that British values must take precedence over any cultural traditions or faiths. No distinctive culture or religion supersedes our duty to be part of an integrated United Kingdom, Tony Blair said. Well, that's absolutely right. But when you've got millions of children, young people, and indeed adult Muslims, they won't be getting close to any of those values or culture, will they? So it's a huge point. And I would just say that the Labour Party, which is in a Faustian pact with its Muslim vote, as we saw with the disgraceful episode of trying to hold out against a national inquiry for the majority Pakistani rape gangs, really not wanting to have an inquiry because it would shine an unfortunate spotlight on Labour collusion with some of those dreadful men. But now what we're seeing, far from the open discussion of this very fraught problem, we've got Angela Rayner, Deputy Prime Minister, working on a new legal definition of Islamophobia, which would certainly see me in jail, and many, many people who are trying to raise the topic of hundreds of thousands of white working class girls being raped could be accused of saying something unpleasant about Muslimness. So the official response now, 20 years after those heinous attacks, is to try and gag the people who want to have a proper discussion about the trouble that's being stored up for our country.
Interesting that Tony Blair has injected himself into this debate, and rightly so, in my view, because I agree with you. He is by far and away the shrewdest analyst of this issue, the most honest, prominent figure on the centre-left of British politics.
Absolutely.
And I'm not sure if he's a Planet Normal fan, but I tip my hat to him when it comes to this subject.
So do I.
And also bring back Tony Blair, crikey, when it comes to Labour's tax and spend policy. It is the case, Alison, as I've said in the past on Planet Normal, that whereas Rachel Reeves is the sort of standard bearer for fiscal prudence in this Labour cabinet on the Labour front bench, she would be towards the left of Tony Blair's front bench. Tony Blair's front bench was much more kind of fiscally responsible.
Yes.
Not the Chancellor himself, but a lot of the rest of the front bench was railed against the Chancellor. Blair always made sure he had very forceful, intellectually agile people in the room who understood financial markets and had really sophisticated experience of financial markets when Brown was making his big spending moves, and yet Starmer has none of that. And we saw at PMQs, Alison, I wrote on Sunday that a wealth tax is coming. Monday, Neil Kinnock said Labour are exploring the idea. Then Rachel Reeves refused to rule it out. Kemi Badenoch went on that subject at PMQs on Wednesday. And again, Starmer refused to rule out a wealth tax, refused to rule out a further freezing, a disgraceful freezing of income tax thresholds. They're going to end up being frozen for 6 or 7 years at this rate. The ultimate stealth tax, more and more and more people being drawn into the tax net, moderately paid middle-ranking teachers and nurses now becoming upper-rate taxpayers. These are not wealthy people. They should not be paying tax at 40% and then national insurance on top of that. It's completely mad. And yet that is what is happening. And I do worry about a wealth tax at a time when the UK is losing a huge number of weather makers, if you like, investors, financiers, due to the change in the non-dom tax rules. Rachel Reeves has acknowledged that the non-dom tax rules are actually leading to an exodus of investors and business leaders and will lead to less tax revenue. The OBR itself has acknowledged, the Office of Budget Responsibility has acknowledged, as has the Treasury, that Labour's increases in capital gains tax for both regular and higher rate taxpayers last October have already led to a big reduction in capital gains tax receipts, Alison. The OBR is talking about a £23 billion reduction in capital gains tax receipts now over the lifetime of this Parliament, and that was on their last estimate. And now the OBR itself, having been quite involved in causing a lot of these problems, in my view, are trying to get ahead of the curve before taxes really go through the roof this October in a way that I think will stall growth even more, make our fiscal position even weaker. Even less tax revenue will come in as tax rates go up and activity stalls. The OBR is now talking about daunting problems in Britain's fiscal outlook. And the OBR is now taking direct pot shots at the government using stronger language, singling out the retreat from even very feeble welfare reforms, which Keir Starmer enacted, pushed in that direction by Angela Rayner, Deputy Prime Minister. The frustration showing on Rachel Reeves' face last Wednesday, which of course we talked about a lot on Planet Normal. I'm actually starting to feel quite sorry for Rachel Reeves. I do think she is not nearly as smart as she thinks she is when it comes to these subjects, but I do think she's a person with decent values, and I do think she has some courage. And she has shown some courage. The Labour left have never liked her, and she has shown some courage by putting forward policies to at least slow down the rate of increase in welfare spending, which is what it is. It's a slowdown in a huge rate of increase of welfare spending. And she did that, and she risked a lot of her political capital, and it was a big emotional thing for her to do, as did Liz Kendall, who I also think is a decent person, who's the welfare secretary. And then Starmer completely threw them under a bus by capitulating to very, very stroppy Labour backbenchers who cannot countenance any reduction at all ever in government spending and largesse, because they basically think, these guys, a lot of them, why don't we just print money? That is the level of their intellectual understanding of how a modern Western society works.
Cannot countenance, cannot count, I think would be my word. In fact, your economic agenda column, I have less sympathy for Rachel Reeves, as you know. Yeah. And your economics agenda column on Sunday will have a link to that in the show notes. So started with this very arresting image of Rachel's tears during Prime Minister's questions, pushed up the 10-year UK gilt yield from 4.51% to 4.66% in a matter of minutes, and imposing a 1 billion plus increase in the annual interest bill on the UK's 2,600 billion stock of national debt. That was a very expensive week, wasn't it, Halligan? A bit costly, but we're all crying now because, I mean, you've been telling me this stuff for a long time, but boy, did this OBR report make for grim reading. I mean, it's really, really dire, isn't it? And indeed, Matthew Lynn, one of our colleagues, wrote in the Telegraph today.
Great writer.
We now have the definitive proof Labour has crashed our economy. And something that jumped out at me, this is the OBR, just putting it so boldly. The UK now has the 6th highest debt, the 5th highest deficit, and the 3rd highest borrowing costs among 36 advanced economies. And it went on to say basically that tax rises in the Reeves autumn budget are now deemed inevitable to plug this widening fiscal chasm, though of course we highly trained amateur economists will know that the move to do that.
I'm the amateur, you're a professional. You're Britain's leading Welsh origin blonde haired economist. With size 4 feet.
It's a small but highly contested field, as you can imagine. But these actual tax rises in the forthcoming autumn budget, which we all, of course, look forward to with great glee, they in turn risk further stifling growth, don't they, Liam? So we're now in what you've often described to me as the doom loop. And I guess that there are many questions that come to mind, apart from anything else. They do point out the OBR points out the absolutely staggering cost of net zero. So that would be something that we could strike off the books immediately to try and rein things in. But I suppose this idea, not just these dismal growth prospects, but the fact that vast amounts are being spent on public services, which aren't any better than they were before. So that's another thing. And I suppose I would say to you, are we now at a stage where it's become too hard for politicians to say no to people? I mean, nobody wants to have stuff taken away from them. And as you said, Liam, Rachel Reeves's attempt to cut welfare was absolutely trifling, really, wasn't it? I mean, it was going to cut 5 billion over quite a long period of time.
It was going to turn a 65 to a 100 billion pound increase from a 65 to a 95 billion pound increase under just one heading of welfare spending. That is indeed the question, Alison. Is it too hard? I don't think it's too hard because we will have to do it.
Yeah.
Fiscal implosions, financial crises, they happen slowly and then very, very, very quickly because financial markets impose themselves. And I see absolute lunacy on Twitter from Labour backbenchers. Oh, governments are in charge, not financial markets. Sixth form student politicians who happen to be in the House of Commons.
Yeah.
I mean, open a history book. Talk to anybody who actually understands how government financing actually works. The government is borrowing £150 billion a year. If the government hadn't borrowed that £150 billion a year, then loads of people wouldn't have got their benefits. Loads of hospitals would have closed down. Loads of things that people rely on. And if they hadn't have appeared, there'd have been mass hysteria because the government borrowed that £150 billion, because it's spending so much more money on nonsense elsewhere. It's borrowing £150 billion. And by the way, the OBR forecast at the beginning of the last financial year, when we borrowed £150 billion, we'd only borrow about £65 billion. So it was out by 80 or 90 billion pounds error in 1 year in the borrowing. And yet we're having arguments about fiscal headroom of less than 10 billion in 5 years' time. Utter displacement activity, utter nonsense. But the government's borrowing 150 odd billion pounds a year, Alison, while it's paying 105 billion pounds a year on interest to service previous borrowing. That is a Ponzi scheme.
With Islamist terrorism and the small boats crisis very much in the news, our guest this week is one of the UK's foremost experts on immigration and demographic change. Professor Matt Goodwin was formerly a professor of politics at the University of Kent for 9 years. He's now a presenter for GB News and a highly sought-after speaker and commentator on populism and right-wing movements. Matt's research has covered a range of topics, including Brexit, British politics, the implications of rising ethnic diversity in the West, and the future of Europe. Matt Goodwin is the author of 2 Sunday Times bestsellers, Values, Voice and Virtue, The New British Politics, and National Populism, The Revolt Against a Liberal Democracy, co-authored with Roger Eatwell. He's also the co-author of Revolt on the Right, Explaining Support for the Radical Right in Britain, which was long listed for the Orwell Prize. Matt Goodwin has an excellent Substack, to which I subscribe at mattgoodwin.org, close to Nigel Farage and the rising success of Reform UK. He has been pivotal in shaping the fast-moving debate about mass migration and its effect on Britain. This week, Matt Goodwin posted on X, "I found the 20th anniversary of the 7/7 Islamist attacks odd and disturbing. Our leaders live in a parallel universe." I asked Matt Goodwin what it was that he found disturbing.
Well, I just listened to the likes of Sadiq Khan talk about how we've built a safer London. Yvette Cooper said that we will always confront the threats facing this country. And I just thought, well, hang on a minute. We have an open border policy. We have no control over who's coming in and out of the country. We know many of those people are young men, often from Islamic nations. We don't know who they are, what they believe. We know they've included alleged terrorists. We know they've included murderers and rapists. We're running a mass legal migration policy at the same time, but we don't have any integration strategy in this country. 20 years on from 7/7, multiculturalism, I think most people would accept is not working, yet we have no replacement to that. And I don't think we're having anything close to a serious national conversation about Islamism. We have sectarianism in the House of Commons. We have Muslim votes being organised openly along religious lines. We have roughly 80 Sharia courts in the country. We've still got a school teacher in hiding that nobody seems to talk about anymore. And now we've got Labour pushing ahead with a dodgy new definition of Islamophobia to try and control debate about these issues. So I just said, look, here's a thought experiment. If somebody had come to you in the aftermath of 7/7 and said, this is what British society will look like 20 years from now, what would you have thought? And I don't think you would think this is a suitable, effective, proper response to the events of 7/7.
Well, I agree with you. And I found the euphemism, the Prime Minister saying lives were lost. Well, they weren't lost down the back of a sofa, were they? I mean, people were horribly wrenched from this world by, crazy ideologues, really. But Matt, I did go back and look at a speech I remembered that the then Prime Minister Tony Blair gave about 17 months after the bombings. And he did give a rather hard-hitting lecture on religious tolerance and cultural assimilation. And Blair basically called on Muslims to integrate into British society. He warns that British values must take precedence over any cultural traditions or faith. And he said belief in democracy, rule of law, tolerance, equal treatment for all, respect for this country and its shared heritage, that is where we come together. And that's what gives us the right to call ourselves British. At that point, no distinctive culture or religion supersedes our duty to be part of an integrated United Kingdom. Fine words there from Tony Blair. Nothing much was done at all, Matt, was it? Can we point to anything that was done to bring that integration and not operating outside British law about?
No, I think we've gone backwards at a very quick pace. Compare David Cameron in 2010 saying, look, multiculturalism has failed. Well, when Suella Braverman said that only a year or so ago, there was a complete meltdown within our ruling class who cannot now even tolerate any criticism of the idea of multiculturalism. And I think at the same time, how we think about Britishness and Englishness has gone backwards. From Tony Blair onwards, the dominant view among the people who run Britain is that being British or being English now is just about welcoming other people. But actually, that's like saying we have no real identity of our own. And so the distinctive qualities of our national identity, our shared values, our sense of history are being rapidly eroded, not only by the people who preside over the institutions, but simply, Alison, by the pace of change that is now flowing through British society. I think, and I've never had this opportunity to have the conversation with Tony Blair, but I suspect even he would now say the scale of migration and the pace of migration, that will leave, for example, white Britons a minority by 2063, that will see people born outside of the UK and their children become a majority by 2079. I think even Blair would say it is almost impossible to integrate a country that is undergoing that scale of demographic change. We've never done this before in history.
No.
We certainly have never seen it on these islands before. And so in the aftermath of 7/7, briefly there was a conversation about, well, are people leading parallel lives? Are they sleepwalking to segregation? Is it time for a more assimilationist model over a broken multiculturalism that prioritizes the differences between groups, not what they share in common? Yet that conversation now has gone nowhere. And even worse, whenever you raise questions about those issues, as we've seen after the Southport protests and riots, even when you raise questions now about those issues, the instinctive reflex of our Prime Minister, Home Secretary and others is to say, well, all of that stuff is just far right. And I think our debate has become quite amateurish. It's become quite childish. We have ducked the big issues. Labour MPs talk about harassment and intimidation, but they never say who is harassing them, even though it's very obvious that this is rooted in a dogmatic Islamism. And just lastly, as we saw in the aftermath of the Manchester Evening News bombing and the murder of Sir David Ames, our national conversation now, I find to be quite absurd in the aftermath of terrorist attacks, where we tell people don't look back in anger or be nicer to one another online. This is not a serious response. So I think we've gone backwards.
Yes. I mean, as you say, whenever there's any mention of Islamist terror, and there's certainly, I think it was only Kemi Badenoch this week in relation to the bombings who actually said the word of where the perpetrators came from. But they do always add, don't they? And the threat from the far right, absurdly, as if that was some sort of equally dangerous force against the British population.
Well, just in terms of one fact that should have been mentioned this week, if you look at every Islamist attack in the UK since 7/7, Islamists have been responsible for 2/3 of all terrorist attacks. Islamists are responsible for about 3/4 of the MI5 caseload in this country. And we know we have 43,000 extremist jihadist Islamists who the security services consider to be of concern. So if you just look at the facts, there is no comparison between the two. Radical violent Islamism remains the dominant threat, and we need to have a national conversation that reflects that.
Do you think the political class are scared of what's been created by mass immigration? Are they just hoping it will all work out somehow?
I think there is a great deal of nervousness in particularly the left of politics within the Labour Party about talking about Islamism, as we saw with the rape gang scandal. Labour is instinctively nervous about discussing these issues. But I think also among the ruling class more generally, I think there is probably an acknowledgement that the policy decisions of the last 30 years have brought us to this point, but to accept that publicly would be to further open the door to the Reform Party, anti-establishment challengers. I just don't think the establishment can take responsibility for its own decisions, because politically it's just a very, very difficult thing to do. But obviously, mass migration has weakened our society and divided our society. Losing control of the borders has put British people and their children at risk. And just on the integration point, I've often made this point. I read Ed Hussein's book, Among the Mosques, a couple of years ago, where he turns up randomly at mosques and he looks at what they're preaching and what's going on. And Ed makes the point in that book that if you're a young British Muslim, you can go your entire day from waking up to going to school, to going to mosque, to going to your local community and shops, and you can not have a single interaction with a member of the non-Muslim majority. Integration has clearly failed in this country. Yet I do not hear Keir Starmer or Yvette Cooper or anybody else actually in Westminster saying, okay, what is the alternative? Are we going to do the Denmark model? Are we going to become an assimilationist country? Are we going to do what the Swedes are doing, encouraging voluntary repatriation? Are we going to do what the French have done in clamping down on Islamist preachers and networks? We're not even having that conversation as a country, which again is another big cause for concern.
Even President Macron, in his speech this week, basically told the Brits to stop having these huge pull factors, which is another thing they don't want to discuss. Now, Matt, you are one of our leading analysts of immigration trends, and recently you've been writing powerfully about how mass migration will change Britain beyond recognition. You even said Britain will be unrecognisable by the end of the century unless things change. Can you give us some specific examples of that demographic change?
Yeah, so we are going to witness a scale of change nobody on these islands has ever seen before. Our population is currently growing at the fastest rate because of mass migration, and about 80% of that is coming from outside of Europe. So if you look at where the country is going to be as we go through the next 75 years, as I say, white Britons are forecast to become a minority by 2063. That will be much earlier among the under 40s, most likely by the year 2050. People born outside of the UK and their immediate children will emerge as a majority in the 2070s. And by the end of this century, somewhere between 1 in 5, 1 in 4 adults will be following Islam, and that will be closer to 1 in 3 among the under 40s. So the pace of change is enormous. Now, when I put that study out, which is based on all of the reliable data that we have from UK government, it's based on the census data, it's very, very rigorous and reliable. Some people said, oh, well, that sounds like a very quick pace of change. I'm not sure, are you exaggerating the pace of this change? Well, last week, Alison, we had some other information from the Office for National Statistics, which showed that actually those changes are well underway. If you look at babies being born in the UK today, close to 1 in 3 across England and Wales are now being born to mothers who were themselves born outside of the UK, and that's closer to 40% in England. And people might say, well, what's the problem with that? I would say the challenge within that, firstly, is that the mothers have often come not from European nations, but have come from the likes of Pakistan, Afghanistan. Iraq is now in the top 10, Nigeria, very different cultures, some might say incompatible cultures. And we know from a lot of research that when you have migration on that scale and you have parents coming from outside of a country, they tend to transplant their cultures into that new country. And so that's why we've begun to see things that we haven't seen before. Little symbols of this change would be the extent to which people are having conversations on speakerphones in the train carriage, which some people find annoying. But in many other nations around the world, that is basically the de facto standard way of communicating. But actually, there are more hideous examples. The rape gangs would be a good one, where Pakistani Muslims transplanted their clan networks from Pakistan into northern communities, and they treated non-Muslims, and particularly white Brits, as being a sort of inferior group in their eyes. And so what I'm saying is the pace of change that's going to go through and the kinds of cultures that we are now importing into the UK are going to raise some really profound challenges. 1 million people don't speak English in the UK currently. More than 300,000 in London cannot speak English at all. We have an estimated 1.2 million illegal migrants in the country. We still have, as the French have made clear, we have no serious answer to the small boat crossings because, in their words, we've become an El Dorado for illegal migrants. We're too generous with welfare. We're too generous with housing. They can get a job within minutes of arriving in the low-skilled food delivery sector. So I think we are just not a serious country anymore when it comes to dealing with these issues. And my big concern, Alison, is as these changes now become more and more visible to Brits, I think we will begin to either see people withdrawing from the social contract, saying, well, why am I going to pay taxes? Why am I going to subsidise nearly half of all social housing in London to go to people who weren't even born in the UK? Why am I going to be subsidising large-scale welfare payments for people from outside the UK who are not even working? Why would I support that kind of social contract? So I think that will come under strain, but also politically, the parties that have presided over the mass immigration experiment, as we can see with the rise of reform, they just don't get it. They don't understand where most Brits are on this issue. Most Brits are saying, look, I'm welcoming, I'm tolerant, but the scale of change that you are imposing on me is completely at odds with what I want to see. I don't really recognise my community anymore, never mind the country, and I want to rapidly slow the pace of change. And the only person who seems to get that is Nigel Farage.
Yes, absolutely. Keir Starmer actually did venture into these waters tentatively the other day, didn't he? Saying we risk becoming an island of strangers. And then he resiled from it in horror, having had it pointed out to him that it sounded a bit like the infamous Enoch Powell speech. I was looking at that Powell speech, Matt, and where he talks about the impact of exactly what you've just described, millions of people from quite alien cultures coming. And Powell said it's like watching a nation busily engaged in heaping up its own funeral pyre. Do you think that British people are waking up to the fact that Powell was actually onto something, Matt? And do you think this talk of civil strife becoming inevitable is overstretching it, or do you worry about that?
Well, the first thing to say is the irony of Keir Starmer's Island of Strangers speech is that's the only time since coming into office that he's actually appeared in touch with what British people are thinking and feeling. YouGov showed that more than half of Brits agreed with Keir Starmer's suggestion that we are now at risk of becoming an island of strangers. He was actually in touch with what people are saying. And then, typical of the new kind of radical left, he decided that he didn't think that after all, and he didn't read the speech before giving it. And he was horrified that he'd muttered those words, which again underlines how I do not think Keir Starmer is a serious prime minister in the sense that he is so inconsistent and all over the place. But what was interesting about that speech, if you read the detail and you look at it in detail, it actually makes a good point, which is that the evidence for mass migration is now falling apart. We know mass migration is weakening the economy. Even the Office for Budget Responsibility accepts that. We know it's making the housing crisis worse. Even Oxford's Migration Observatory accepts that. We know it's driving up crime, particularly rape and sexual assaults. Freedom of information requests have shown that. The intellectual case for mass uncontrolled immigration, Allison, is completely falling apart. And Keir Starmer and his team clearly know that. That's why they gave that speech, even if they changed their minds later on. So I think those of us who are skeptical of this policy, if not openly opposed to this policy, I think we are winning the argument. And I genuinely believe that. The second point about civil strife, look, a colleague of mine, David Betts, a professor at UCL, has made this argument that if Britain, well, his argument is it's too late. Britain is already heading towards some kind of low-level civil conflict where you will have two things going on at the same time. The first is tension between the politicians and the people, that the politicians are no longer representing the people on these really important cultural questions like immigration. And it's definitely the case that over the last 2 or 3 years, the Brits have become much more skeptical about mass migration, which is why we're seeing reform breaking through to 34%. Remember when much of Westminster used to tell us Nigel Farage could never get above 15% of the polls in the polling. Well, now he's on 34%. But the second tension that is layered on top of that is inter-ethnic tension. That what Betts is arguing is that we have now got so many groups in the country that you will increasingly see what we saw, for example, in Hare Hills, Leeds, or what we saw with the gang violence in Southend-on-Sea, or what we saw in the aftermath of the Southpaw atrocities, where you have groups that have irreconcilable cultural beliefs and identities that are now engaging in low-level violence against one another. And Betts says, if you look at developing countries, those factors are needed for violence. But what he is arguing is those factors can now be seen in developed states, particularly the UK. Now, I think he has a point, but I'm not as gloomy and pessimistic because I still think there are a lot of things the UK could do to fix this mess we're in. We could, with a new government, we could end mass uncontrolled immigration. That's a policy choice. It's not an inevitable destination. We could end that policy. We could leave the ECHR. We could reform the Human Rights Act. We could end two-tier policing and reassert common law and equality before the law. We could make our politics more representative, and we could do a lot of things around integration, taking on Islamism that the Swedes are doing, the Danes are doing, even the French and the Germans are now doing. What we don't have, and what we could have, are leaders who understand the scale of that challenge and the necessity for urgent, radical action. Now, if we get that after the next election, I think we could move in a much more positive direction. But, I said on X maybe 2 months ago, we've probably got 2 elections left to really turn the Titanic around. And somebody who popped up in my replies, named Elon Musk, said, no. He said, no, you have 1 election left to turn the Titanic around.
Yeah. I'm with Elon on that, I think. Now, you were a professor of politics at the University of Kent. You're the author of Revolt on the Right, Explaining Public Support for the Radical Right in Britain. No one has a keener insight into the appeal of Reform UK than you do, Matt. Do you think now that Reform, obviously, as you say, they've had a high of 34% in one poll. Do you think Reform will be able to form a majority government in 2029, or do you see a pact with the Tories? And obviously, Nigel Farage is a hugely gifted politician, the most influential political figure of the past quarter century, in my view. But there have been a lot of bust-ups, seems to be struggling with perhaps working with a team of talented individuals, which is what he's going to need to form a significant cabinet. So how do you see those things panning out?
If you look at why people are voting Reform, I've done the largest survey in the country of Reform voters, and you split out all the different issues. The top 2 reasons: number 1, stop the boats. Number 2, lower legal migration. This is a vote that is overwhelmingly driven by concerns over migration and demographic change. So what Reform need, they need the immigration issue to remain right at the forefront of UK politics. The second thing they need, as you imply in your question, is to be able to supply that public demand with a movement that looks competent and credible and coherent. Now, my personal view, given the levels of volatility in British politics now, if you'd said to anybody 5 years ago, 10 years ago, Nigel Farage would be number 1 in the national polls, they would have laughed you out of the room. And that reflects the volatility we've got in the system. I firmly believe Reform are on track to emerge as the largest political party at the next general election. Whether they get a majority or not, I genuinely believe that they will clear out the red wall. They'll win more seats from Labour than Labour lost to Boris Johnson in 2019.
Okay, wow.
They will dominate Wales. They will emerge as a pretty significant vehicle in Scotland, and they will do very well down England's east coast, round into Essex, Kent, and parts of outer London. So they've got the geography that you need to emerge as the largest party. The question then is, could they get into a majority territory either on their own or with some kind of confidence supply arrangement with whatever is left of the Tory party? And I don't think there'll be much left of the Tory party. I don't think anybody can save the Tory party, to be honest. The level of exasperation and frustration in the country is also such that people will also vote for Farage because he is the only alternative to this uniparty that has presided over everything we see today. And I think there's a really important point in this, Alison, which is nobody voted for Labour really because they wanted a Labour government. It was a loveless landslide. Starmer came in on the lowest share of the vote for any incumbent government for years. And I think to some degree, Nigel Farage might experience the same thing, which is millions of people saying, you know what, I've had it with this country. Highest tax burden since the 40s, highest energy prices in the Western world, zero growth, mass immigration, broken borders. Let's just give the next guy a go. And that the next guy happens to be Nigel Farage. And so I think he will partly be propelled forward, not just by 15% who love everything he says, but actually by another 10 to 15% who say, you know what, we've had 30, 50 years of these guys. Let's actually just go with the only other alternative there is. And he's going to have to try and use that and channel that into a serious program of government. But that's how I think we end up with Reform emerging as the largest party.
So final question. We're going to project forward now. You're good at these scenarios, Professor Goodwin. Week 1 of a Reform government. Chancellor Liam Halligan is busy with his chainsaw in number 11. Home Secretary Matthew Goodwin is drawing up the deportation orders. Lots of those. What's on the agenda? Do you believe that Reform government we're foreseeing can rescue the country from the blob, repair the damage done by mass immigration, and how fast do they have to act to outwit the many enemies they're going to encounter?
I've thought about this quite a lot. As a thought experiment, this is what we need. We need a Trump 2 government, not a Trump 1 government, by which I mean we need a shock and awe. We need to go in and have a factory reset in this country. So a bit like your smartphone. When your smartphone becomes overloaded, too many apps, too many videos, it slows down, it becomes sluggish, it's a major source of stress. You reach for the factory reset button. Our country has become like that. It's overloaded, it's slow, it's inefficient. We need a factory reset. What do I mean by that? We need to return this country to the institutional setup that we had before the Blairite Revolution. What do I mean? We need to leave the European Convention on Human Rights. We need to reform Tony Blair's Human Rights Act. We need to reform the Equality Act. We need to reassert our common law tradition. We need to push back on judicial activism and on a legal system that has become openly politicized. We need to end Blair's policy of mass migration. And we need to reassert who we are, our culture, history, and identity. Yes, of course, you can do that with a government, particularly if you have a majority government. Boris Johnson could have done that had he had the will in 2019. Conservatives have never used power in the way that the left have always used power. The left used power to redesign the entire system.
Yeah.
Conservatives have never even bothered to overturn what the left have done. Cameron and Osborne mainstreamed much of the Blairite revolution, and so they set the stage for all the chaos and the carnage that we see around us today, from identity politics through the public sector duty, through to mass migration and broken borders. I believe if you get the right people in there, you can press the factory reset button. This isn't about going back to the 50s. It's about saying this stuff no longer works in terms of keeping our people safe and in terms of building a prosperous, dynamic economy. So we're going to bring about some radical change. And we need a prime minister, a government, a team who can bring about that kind of change. You know, taking on net zero, taking on high taxes, taking on the blob, taking on the civil service, the managerial bureaucracy, dramatically slashing the amount we're spending on welfare, getting people back to work, ending mass migration, detain and deport illegal migrants out of the country, not putting them into the heart of our communities alongside British people and their children. We could have a shock and awe government in this country that would bring about that fundamental reset. And you know what, Alison? I think millions of people out there would say, yeah, actually, I'm really up for this.
Yeah, me too. Matt, it's an absolute pleasure talking to you. Planet Normal listeners, you can read more of Matthew Goodwin on his excellent Substack, to which I am a subscriber. He says I'm the only one, but I think there's quite a lot of us. It's at mattgoodwin.org. Highly recommended. And Matt's new show will be on GB News at 8:00 on Friday. Starting this Friday, yes?
That's right. That's right. Thank you, Alison.
Well, fantastic. Appointment viewing. Matt Goodwin, thanks so much for being on Planet Normal.
Thanks for having me.
Well done, Alison. Always interesting chatting with Professor Matt Goodwin. I got to know Matt pretty well during my time at GB News. The thing about Matt is he's not just a really good orator. He's also, and even a lot of his academic detractors have to acknowledge this, he's also a scholar. He's somebody who is, for a politics specialist, he's a professor of politics, of course. He's also very adept statistically. He's very good at looking up, interpreting, and analysing data, in my experience. And he's emerging, isn't he, from being a sort of academic who writes good, popular books to now a kind of campaigner. He's got his Substack that he writes that's very, very popular. He's going to emerge as a politician of some kind, I think, and probably with reform. He knows all the people at the top of reform. He talks to them often. A very interesting character.
I teased him, Liam, about being Home Secretary in a reform government. And yeah, although it's satirical, I wouldn't be, well, I know, Chancellor Halligan in number 11 would be good. And then we'd have Matt Goodwin. He certainly would grab the issue where it needs to be grabbed. You're right about the grasp of data. I mean, listeners, I think, who haven't heard some of the figures of how fast this country is moving towards not being a white majority and so on. And those figures that Matt has pulled together are pretty shocking. White Britain's a minority by 2063. Things which no one has voted for, Liam. In fact, as we know, with successive general elections, British voters have voted very strongly against increased immigration and not been listened to by the two main political parties, which is why they're now staring down the barrel of extinction in 2029. And listeners should know, actually, that Matt is extremely close, as are you, Liam, to some of the most senior people in reform. So a lot of what you've just heard in that interview, that will be very close to where reform's thinking is at the moment about what they would do if indeed they are returned as the government, which doesn't look at all unlikely at the moment.
Just briefly, of course, we've got this UK-France summit. There's been a lot of spin out of Paris before Emmanuel Macron's arrival, even, and all the pomp and ceremony with the French president, who himself is massively beleaguered, who himself is overseeing a huge, almost debt crisis. It's France that is the real debt problem in the Eurozone these days, not the Italians, not the Spanish. Their economies are going pretty well, actually, compared to the French. He's saying that France, quotes, will deliver on stopping small boat crossings.
Cue hollow laughter.
And of course, there are going to be new powers, we hear, for French border officials to stop small boats in shallow waters. But of course, this is very, very difficult. We've had more small boat crossings so far this year than we had by this time last year, a lot more. And it strikes me, Alison, that what's going to happen in the end is that the UK will leave the ECHR, will leave the European Convention on Human Rights, because a lot of serious lawyers tell me, off the record, of course, because there's the legal profession wants to stay in these things, they get a lot of work out of it, that it's the only way for the UK to consistently have the deterrent of being able to deport people. We've got lots of Tories wanting to leave the ECHR. Of course, it's reform's stated aim. Even people in the Labour Party now are starting to put their head above the parapet in a very timid way, knowing that the strength of feeling, particularly across the north of England and the Midlands, a lot of these red wall seats, where a lot of these people that come over illegally in small boats end up in hotels, in relatively small towns, really upsetting local communities when the only local hotel that's been booked for weddings and so on, celebrations many months in the future, is just commandeered by the state effectively. A lot of those Labour MPs know that reform is coming for them and that ECHR and immigration controls are a major battleground, probably the major battleground of the next general election.
There's no way the Labour government will leave the ECHR. If you cut Starmer down the middle, he's got ECHR written through him like a stick of rock.
Now on to our listener emails. Your messages sent to planetnormal@telegraph.co.uk. Please keep them coming. We learn so much from you, the citizens of Planet Normal.
And this is Hazel on Rachel Reeves' tears. I am crying for the coal pensioners last winter, too anxious to turn up the heating. I am crying for the elderly farmer with his guilt, thinking about taking his life to enable passing on the hard work of previous generations to his sons. I am crying for the fishermen whose livelihoods have been decimated, unable to fish in our own British waters, says Hazel. I'm crying for the children, watching their parents work harder and longer to keep them in the private schools where they are happy and thriving. I'm crying for the grandparents watching their children under financial pressure, wondering how on earth they can help. I'm crying for the small business entrepreneurs having to work harder, too scared to risk taking on new employees with increasing overheads. I'm crying for the misuse of taxation to waste on so much irrelevance at a time of great need. I'm crying for the treatment of Lucy Connolly and the two-tier justice system if Bob Villan goes free. But most of all, says Hazel, I am crying for the values, traditions, culture and institutions rapidly disappearing from the country that I love.
Very powerful there. A mention by Hazel of Bob Villan, the singer who was chanting death to IDF, the Israeli Defence Force, from the stage at the Glastonbury conference recently. This is from Chris. Dear Allison and Liam, I'm both a long-term Planet Normal listener and ex-long-term member of the Conservative Party who has, like so many others, moved firmly across to reform. The key point, it seems to me, is one that Allison has just made on Planet Normal, but is one rarely made by commentators of the Conservative reform tussle for the soul of what's essentially your constituency, plus disillusioned members of all the other parties. That is, it's completely useless to elect a Tory party that still comprises a large number of MPs who are basically Lib Dems. Indeed, proportionately more of these people than was the case before the last election because of the way the voting patterns worked out last year. We keep seeing great ideas from leading Conservatives in the Telegraph. Today's is a call to act sickness benefit for foreigners. Why didn't the Tories implement this obviously sensible policy during their 14 years in power?
Yeah.
Because the Lib Dems in their ranks would either force a centrist leader onto the party once in power or force the existing leaders to quietly shelve this type of policy as being too hard or too tough. There's now no alternative in the last chance saloon to a party made up of people who are genuinely keen for real reform and not afraid to make the tough calls. Thank you both. Best wishes, Chris. And this is from Elizabeth. Dear Allison and Liam, when Keir Starmer made his Island of Strangers speech, I thought that at last he'd seen the light, had a Damascene conversion moment, and had started to relate to the British people. Wow. Then a few days later, he tells us that 1, he didn't write the speech, 2, he hadn't read it beforehand, 3, he didn't mean it. Well, that says it all. So unfit to be Prime Minister. Kind regards, Elizabeth.
This is from Jem. I am such a fan of Planet Normal. So is Linda, my wife. Hooray! It's essential listening every week. Thanks for all you do and for keeping us at least a little bit sane. Well, I can't after this week. I mean, God knows. Have you heard the economy's tanking, Jem? Anyway, says Jem, here's a short poem. Oh, good. 1 year Keir. 1 year Keir. A whole year here, Keir. From free gear Keir, and of course 2-tier Keir, to never hear Keir, all in a year Keir. From Starmer the farmer harmer, to cold-hearted Granny Harmer, you turning alarmingly Starmers, not quite a working people charmer Starmer. And look over here Keir, will Rachel last the year Keir? Can you not see her Keir? Her 2 tears Keir, oh very good. Keep up the good work, says Jem.
I tell you what, Bob the Bard's just had a run for his money there, yeah? Bob, I know you think you're too good for more Planet Normal mugs. Bob the Bard, of course, being our famous corresponding poet who always says mug winner. And he says, don't send me more mugs. Don't send me more mugs. Jem, I tell you, that is a very, very good contribution. And finally, this is from Susan. I'm so grateful for your wonderful podcast, says Susan. Look, guys, we really don't pay people to write these emails. They write them of their own accord. I'm not related to Susan, neither is Alison. These are genuine. Susan says, I'm so grateful for your wonderful podcast. It lets me know that I'm not alone and others feel the same about so many things. Please keep buggering on, says Susan. I fail to understand why Keir Starmer, when he was reading a speech he claims never to have written or read before, could not be more like BBC newsreader Martine Croxall when she was given the phrase pregnant people on the auto cue and she immediately corrected it to women. Well done, Martine. Job well done. Best wishes, Susan. And on that bombshell, that's it from Planet Normal for another week. As we leave our sanctuary of sweet reason, our flying refuge of reasoned views. Email of the week, Alison?
Oh, has to be Jem for that.
Jem storms into pole position.
A gem from Jem, thank you.
A gem from Jem. So, Jem, send us an email at planetnormal@telegraph.co.uk. Put mug winner in the subject heading. Give us your postal address, and our wonderful Planet Normal team will send you a rare as rocking horse poo Planet Normal mug. And as we speed away from our beloved Planet Normal, the madness of planet Earth comes back into view. Thanks as ever to our producers, Cass Ho, James Hodgson, and Louisa Wells. Stay safe and in touch with us and with each other. Until next week, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him.